He said, Saripatra, what do you think? Why is it named All Mindful Buddha Sutra? Saripatra, if good men and good women listen to the sutra, accept and uphold it, and also hear the names of all Buddhas, then all these good men and good women will be protected and kept in mind by all Buddhas. All will be non-retro progress from the supreme and perfect enlightenment. So we can see that those who recite and uphold the sutra, recite and uphold doesn't mean just read, but you have to put it into practice. When we learn about loving kindness, it's not just lip service that we are doing to ourselves, but we are actually applying it. Like for example, what we just learned from our meditation session is when we apply loving kindness, we are directing loving kindness towards ourselves, friends and family, stranger, foes and enemies, and all sentient beings. So different tiers that we practice. For example, if we don't love ourselves, it is very difficult to be showing loving kindness towards others. If we don't appreciate who we are not comfortable with who we are, it's very difficult to have loving kindness towards others. So we bring it back to reality, say we really have to appreciate who we are, know what we want, and be comfortable with who we are. And then from there, you will have enough energy to show loving kindness towards friends and family. And of course, it's easier to show loving kindness to your loved ones because they show love to you. So it's very easy to reciprocate that. And to take one step further is to show loving kindness towards strangers, people we don't know very well, but we still want to wish them health, wellness, and prosperity. And then the next level is even more difficult because so all the three levels before that are preparation for us to expand that circle of loving kindness towards our foes and enemies, right? Those who want to harm us, those who are a thorn in our eyes, as you will. And so it's very difficult to wish them well when we know that they are always trying to harm us. But Buddhism goes beyond that and wants us to expand that circle of loving kindness to include foes and enemies, and then all sentient beings, not just human beings, but plants, all elements of nature, even unseen beings, invisible beings. And so when we learn loving kindness, we should apply it, because every time you apply loving kindness, you gain another level of understanding. And every level, the more that you expand it, the more that you understand the concept. So when we study this Amida Sutra, it's not just to recite and wishing that the Buddhas will protect us. That's not what it means. When we apply it, we are empowering ourselves to protect ourselves, but also to resonate with those who are kind and loving. And so when we see in the sutras that the Buddhas protect or support those who recite this sutra. But what does that mean? And when we feel so devotional, if you will, about Buddhism, and we want to protect or support Buddhism, what does that mean? So the topic I want to share with you today is, when we say we want to support Buddhism, are we supporting Buddhism with the right reasons or the wrong reason, right? Because there are people who like Buddhism for the wrong reason. So misinterpretations from fans and foes alike. And we should understand this because we have departed from Shakyamuni Buddha more than 2,500 years. So there have been a lot of translations, interpretations, and of course, just like a copy machine, right? The more you make copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, it becomes blurry and blurry. And same thing, when we hear interpretations, we interpret differently, and then when we try to introduce it to somebody else, we interpret how we have understood it, and it becomes further and further away. And this is to help us to bring it back to reality, to the origin of Buddhism, and why is it that we want to study Buddhism? What is it in it that we want to study Buddhism? just like any investment, right? When you study Buddhism, you're investing time and energy. And with any investment, you expect a return. So why would anybody want to invest time and energy? What are you getting out of it? And that's what we want to discuss today, is to understand how can we get benefits from studying Buddhism, but how do we know that we are obtaining benefits and not harm at the end, all right? Because something that is very sweet, it may not be very healthy. Okay, so the Bodhidharma, which is refers to as the Buddhism, if you will, today, nowadays we know as Buddhism, but back then, but there was no Buddhism during the Buddha's day. He was just teaching, sharing what he had gained from his enlightenment. But over time, science has turned this teaching into Buddhism. So the Bodhidharma, Bodhi here means enlightenment. Dharma means the truth, or the truth about enlightenment, transformed by modern science into Buddhism. So that's how we get to Buddhism. There was no Buddhism during the Buddha's day. Of course, now Buddhism has had to suffer misrepresentation at the hands of friends and foes alike. And that is because of misunderstanding. And where does this misunderstanding come from? Well, it comes from ignorance. It comes from delusion. And that is because, although may have come from a good heart, good intention, but we should understand that intellect is a counterpart of delusion, and which is driven by lust and hatred. And lust and hatred are really two sides of the same coins. You cannot have one without the other. So if somebody who is very devotional but without a good, solid understanding of the principle, then that's delusional. That is just that's just emotional. And of course, with any emotion, it can fluctuate. Right? One day you may like it, next day you may hate it, if it doesn't jive with your interest. And so the feeling of attraction is inseparable from that of repulsion when there is preference versus something of repulsion. And so there are those who dislike Buddhism for the right reason. So what does that mean? What are the right reasons for somebody to dislike Buddhism? Why is it that? What does this mean that somebody who dislikes Buddhism for the right reason? Well, for example, like Buddhists who pursue personal spiritual liberation for themselves, right? They want to enter meditation, and that's what they want to pursue, is their own personal liberation. And that's called Hinayana, the small way, the small vehicle. It's just that they only have their own personal interest in pursuing Buddha and their own liberation. And it's understandable because it's so difficult to try to help others, right? You help others and then they backstabbed you. And so when they encounter situations like that, they say, the world is crazy. Everybody's crazy. They're on their own. Forget them. I'm just gonna go on my own way. And so that is Hinayana, which is the small way. And that is a person who has given up the Bodhi mind, the enlightenment mind, the achieving enlightenment for the sake of all sentient being. That spirit of Buddhism, in its original sense, has been lost in that kind of personal pursuit for spiritual liberation. Another example is that wishing to migrate to Sukhavati, which is the Western Pure Land, the Western paradise of Amitabha, the Buddha, at the expense of others. Meaning that they don't fulfill their responsibilities. All they want is to be in the Western Pure Land, to be with the Buddhas and listen to the Buddha's lectures ages upon ages. Okay, because after they've read about the sutra, they read the sutra how that when you go there, you don't need to work. If you think about food appears. You think about clothes appear. So all the conveniences there. Life is great, so why not go there? And so when they see hardships in this life, they wish to be there to avoid hardship. So that's at the expense of others, right? They have their own families, commitments. They have their job commitment. but yet they don't want to attend to those commitments. All they want is to be in the Western paradise to enjoy life. So that's something that is not proper. Another example is to practice meditation, and it leads to isolations and insensitivity towards others. Meditative bliss is wonderful, right? It's very attractive, it's very addictive, and yet it can be harmful. Not harmful in a sense of it deteriorates your physical senses, like drugs. Drugs can also induce that kind of calm as well, but it deteriorates your body physically. But with meditation, it doesn't deteriorate your physical body, but it deteriorates your spirituality, your mind, because it makes you insensitive to others. Because when you sit in meditation, you are trying to numb your senses. You are trying to suppress all the problems, all the difficulties, and you're trying to reach the meditative bliss. It's just like those who take drugs. The reason they take drugs is because they cannot deal with reality. The physical pain is unbearable, right? The responsibility, the reality is so unbearable that they want to take drugs. They drink themselves away to forget today and hope for the best tomorrow. And so that's why people take drugs, is to avoid reality. So similarly, if we're not careful, when we practice meditation and we have this sip of meditative bliss, it is very inviting. It is very tempting to continue to have that meditative bliss, and therefore it draws you in, and you don't want to get out, and it makes you insensitive. It isolates you because you don't want to deal with interferences, because those interferences degrade your meditative bliss, and therefore it makes you more and more isolated and insensitive. And so when we practice Buddhism that way, when we practice meditation, and it makes us more isolated and become more sensitive, then we know that we're pursuing something very personal, very self-centered, right? And so that's the reason. That's why people. That's why when people look at Buddhists who practice Buddhism that way, they don't like Buddhism. It's because it makes them, in a sense, you can say, irresponsible to the world, right? So those are just some examples. But there are those who like Buddhism for the wrong reason. And what's the wrong reason here? For example, when we learn about the concept of voidness, or anatman, no self, that concept of no self is so powerful because it makes you feel very omnipotent. It makes you feel very powerful in the sense that everything is void, therefore it cannot hurt you. And when you learn about that concept and you must understand it, it leads to the belief that nothing exists, that there is nothing that can harm you, because nothing exists. And the result is that when we have the wrong understanding of the concept of voidness, is that it will make us lack purpose and motivation. And the result of that is that it makes us lazy. We don't want to do anything because what's the point of doing anything, because it's nothing. It's void. Nothing exists. So therefore, why should I put in the effort to even try to do anything? And that's the harm in misunderstanding the concept of voidness or no self. Another example of the wrong understanding is that to see Buddhism as purely a philosophy, because it distorts the Dharma. Philosophy does not care about the foundation of morality, and philosophy actually leads to a differentiation between object and subject. There is always something to compare, and that is duality, and that is not Buddhism. And to see Buddhism as philosophy is not complete. Buddhism is neither philosophy in the sense of morality. Buddhism is neither religion in the sense of believing a personal God. And so when we see Buddhism as philosophy only, then it does not make it very applicable in it. It's just a form of study. Another example of how is that to become attached to the letter of the sutras, or when we read the precepts and the words exact like that, it restricts us and it does not allow Buddhism to grow, because every culture has its own interpretation, and Buddhism can flourish. It is because it accommodates. Buddhism does not go to, when it spreads to another country, it doesn't take over the country, but it blends with the culture and it grows with the culture. For example, if you go to a museum, you may have seen this. There are statues that of the Buddha, but they look different, right? There are different artistic characteristics of that piece of art. Like Thailand, for example, very pointed top of the Buddha's head, whereas Iran may have different characteristics. And so every culture has its own interpretation, because that's how it makes Buddhism applicable to their daily lives. And so, but when we say Buddhism, this is how Buddhism is, and we are restricting it, right? Buddhism originated in India, and that's how it should be. Then we were not allowing Buddhism to grow to help others. And so that's, so even though we call ourselves Buddhists, but if we misinterpret Buddhism, then we are harming Buddhism, right? So misunderstanding is ultimately more fatal to the Dharma. So if one claims to be a Buddhist full of devotion, but does not have a solid understanding of the Buddha, meaning we have to attend lectures and we have to read books and study with a guru, then it can be very harmful to ourselves, right? It can lead to a lack of motivation, misunderstanding, and then what happens is that one gets consumed by negativity and becomes useless to society in a sense, right? Another harm to Buddhism, this is more external, is that there can be malicious representations and deliberate distortions of the Buddhist doctrine. So this is more external. So this author, he says, nowadays Buddhism has more often to pray for protection from its friends than from its enemies. All right, the number of those who like Buddhism for the wrong reason, wrongly imagine what Buddhism is increasing. And that is the growing threat to the purity and integrity of the doctrine that they profess to support. So what is wrong reason? What's the wrong path? So it helps us to see what's wrong, what's right, to help us to make that selection. The wrong path is that such people who have developed strong religious convictions prior to their study of Buddhism. For example, they jump right into the practice of right mindfulness and right meditation without proper preparation. The proper preparation is to follow the Eightfold Path, right? The Eightfold Path you are all familiar with starts with right view, right contemplation, right speech, right karma, and right livelihood. See, all those things prepare us for right diligence, right mindfulness, and right meditation. Why is that? With the right view, it tells you to head in the right direction because you can put in a lot of efforts, but if you're like shooting an arrow, if you're pointing the wrong directions, no matter how perfect you are, no matter how strong you are, you're not going to get to the target. So that's why it's important to have this right motivation, right view. Right contemplation is, of course, to think good thoughts, to think kind thoughts. Here is all skillful thoughts, right? You think a lot about helping people, loving kindness. So that's a lot of contemplating, a lot about all your thinkings, all your thoughts are skillful. And when you are skillful in your thoughts, it automatically leads to right speech. You will say the right things. You will say the proper things, right? If you have nothing bad in your mind, you will say good things. And when you say good things, when you think good things, automatically it leads you to right karma, which is right action, right? It leads to doing the right things. And right livelihood is that to have a career that is meaningful, doing something that is meaningful, that you don't feel ashamed, you don't have any regrets in your work. And why is this important? Well, from here, we should understand that Buddhism is very realistic. It brings us back to reality. I mean, have you ever heard about having a good career in achieving enlightenment? Not very often, right? People don't often emphasize that, but having a good career is part of achieving enlightenment. Why is that? Well, imagine this way. If you want to practice meditation, you want to sit in meditation, enjoy that meditative bliss, or just have a day free of distraction to practice meditation, to do what you like. But yet, if there are bills that you have to pay, people are calling you to collect your debt, and you don't know where your next meal is going to come from. Your refrigerator is empty. Ladies and gentlemen, it is very difficult to be sitting in meditation to enjoy that session, right? Isn't it right? Right? So Buddhism is very realistic that we should do the best we can to prepare ourselves when you have merits. When you have merits is what? Merit is, the purpose of merit is to help you to overcome difficulties. If you lack merits, it is very difficult to overcome difficulties. It is very difficult to be thinking about spirituality. And so studying the Eightfold Path is very practical. Here, the Buddha is telling us that when you want to have spiritual liberation, you first need to have physical liberation. We need to be free in what we do, free in living a life, meaning financial independence, emotional independence, right? All those things help us to achieve spiritual liberation. Money is good. Having money is good, but it should not be the primary purpose. There is nothing wrong with living a good life. There's nothing wrong with driving a nice car, living in a good house. But that should not be our primary purpose, right? Those things help us to make life easy. Just like you want to get to the top floor, you have to rely on the lower floors, right? You can't say, I don't need the bottom floors and then jump right into the top floor. It's not realistic. It's not practical. So the practical way is to make sure we're heading in the right direction with the right view. We know that the money that we have is good. We recognize its value, but it's not good enough. That's why we want to pursue something more, and that's spiritual liberation. Because money cannot make us happy, right? There are people who are very rich, but yet they still suffer. So there's a saying that even rich people cry, and that's because money cannot bring happiness. The only way that we can bring happiness to ourselves is to understand reality, to understand the truth, and to understand what is important, what can give us that lasting impact, right? And so having a good career is very important to help us to achieve that meditation. Because once you have that financial independence, which is not the primary goal, but it helps us to take on the next step, right? And so the wrong path is to jump right into meditation. I want to practice meditation. I want to reach enlightenment. I want to have the meditative bliss, but there's no foundation, and therefore it's not realistic. You can try to sit meditation, but it won't last very long, right? Just like a house without a strong foundation would not last very long. Just like the incidents that we recently have in Florida, right? Those tall condos, right? They collapsed because they did not have strong foundation. Right? So with a strong foundation, the higher you go, the better you are. But without a strong foundation, it is very dangerous to go very high, meaning to commit yourself to meditation without a strong foundation. Right? So that's the wrong path if we don't have the strong foundation. So although genuinely attracted by certain aspect of the Dharma, they do not hesitate to challenge, misinterpret, and simply explain away, because they think that studying Buddhism intellectually, they think that they have understood it, and so they go out and they explain themselves away without a strong foundation. Like telling people to, meditate, just like ignore everything. Nothing is real, nothing exists. Just ignore everything. Well, that's wrong way of introducing Buddhism to other people. Because if you are in a position of power and you have a lot of followers, then when you whatever you say carries weight. And when you say the wrong things and people follow, I mean, that could be, and the consequences could be detrimental, right? So we should be careful, right? So one of the most original contributions of the Buddha to human knowledge is the discovery that theories are rooted in desires. And that's why it's not reliable to have that intellectual understanding, because that intellectual understanding still has the three poisons: greed, anger, and delusion, right? So clinging to their erroneous interpretations of the Dharma, it is unmistakable indications of the extent of their emotional commitment, meaning that they want to introduce Buddhism to them, to other people, not because they want others to understand the truth, but they want to elevate their own self-esteem, their own ego. Because the more that people listen to them, follow them, the more secure they feel. So it becomes a conversion. They want to convert other people to have more followers, not for the sake of the truth, but they want to increase their survival in a sense, right? Because it's all emotional. So theories of a personal God and immortal soul are so deeply rooted in the soil of the human heart that belief in them has often been regarded as synonymous with religion itself. Such belief is not synonymous with the Dharma. So the Buddha does not accept the concept of a personal God. Buddhism does not reject gods. It sees there are heaven beings, gods, but it does not accept that there is a personal God, a one source of creation. Because according to conditionality, there is no one single source of creation. Things exist because of conditions. Because otherwise you can never answer the question of then, well, if there is a source of creation, then what is the source of that source of creation? And then what is that source of that source of that source of creation? And so you can never answer that question, right? So the Buddha taught that belief in a personal God and an immortal soul were of our craving for love and protection, our attachments to our own personalities, and our thirst for life. So this, right, the belief that there is somebody who can create it all is a search for security. That if somebody who's responsible for everything, then I don't need to be responsible for the things that happen. I don't need to be responsible for the things that happen to me or the world because, hey, there's somebody else who's responsible for it. So it's much easier just to place the blame on somebody else than to take responsibility, right? Buddhism is saying, well, we are responsible for our own actions. Things that happen is because of us. And so therefore, we should be responsible. We should put in the efforts to make things better. Right? Otherwise, it's just a craving for love and protection. So enlightenment can be attained by renunciation, not only of selfish desires, but of the religious theories or views. So this renunciation of selfish desire is that this craving. When we have craving for something, it may make us feel satisfied at first, but it's not ultimate. The reason is not ultimate. The reason that of selfishness cannot bring us true liberation is because with selfishness, whatever that we have gained, there is fear behind it, right? If we have this selfish motive or selfish goal to acquire wealth, for example, then there is fear behind it of losing that wealth. So this it's not the accumulation of wealth that's problematic. It's the self-centeredness that is problematic. If you have wealth, but there is no personal agenda in trying to protect that, then there is no fear. You can use that money to live your life and to help others. It's just the problem is when there is self-centeredness, and that makes you become protective, and that makes you fearful of losing what you have accumulated. Right? Are you following me? Right? That self-centeredness is poisonous. It's because it creates fear. For example, I'll use an example. When you were a kid, you liked your toys, and you did not like you. Let's say you didn't want to share with your toys because your toys were precious to you. You didn't want to share your toys. But as you grew older, you realize that those toys, although they may be fun, but they're no longer valuable. And so you have no fear in losing that toy. In fact, you can give to your toy to another person, another kid, so he can enjoy that toy. Because you no longer have that self-centeredness in acquiring that toy. Therefore, there's no fear. Does it make sense? All right? So whenever there is self-centeredness, fear follows. And that's why the things that we accumulate based on self-centeredness cannot bring true and complete liberation. It's because of that, right? In fact, they become hindrances because they restrict us. We become fearful. For example, those who are willing to take a risk is because they're willing to take risks because they have less to lose. The more that you have to lose, the less risky you become. You agree, right? Right. So our desires, our personal desires, selfish desires, become hindrances. And when we practice Buddhism and we still have that, continue to harbor selfish desires, it would compel us to have this emotional needs, and it will lead to misunderstandings and misinterpretations. And so when they still have this personal selfish desire there, they would say, well, the Buddha must have believed in God, right? He could have not have denied the existence of Atman. So in India, they have this called the super self, Atman, like the soul, the great being called Atman, the great self. But that's the Buddha rejected that idea. And so here it says the wisdoms of the Tathagatas. The Tathagatas refers to the Buddha. Is not to be measured by the yardstick of human intelligence, nor limited by the cravings of the human heart. So we should not, when we still have our selfish craving, it's very difficult to see beyond our selfish cravings, right? So what makes people give up on studying Buddhism, or at least they don't last very long, is because they have selfish craving. They nurture the notion of this ego, the notion of this selfish existence. The reason is because Buddhism teaches no self. So Buddhism is heading into this direction of no self, but this person is harboring this notion of self. And so they are diverging. So eventually something's got to give, right? The more that you diverge, eventually you will have this spiritual inconsistency, right? You believe in yourself, things you do because of fame and fortune, things you do because of personal gain, but that you're preaching the words of no self. Eventually, the separation will be too far that you will not be able to handle. And that's why if we approach Buddhism that way, eventually we will give up because of the inconsistency, the spiritual inconsistency. We can no longer handle those internal conflicts. So the spiritual inconsistency will eventually create internal conflicts, and then eventually there will be separation. Right? So that's the wrong path. The right path, or the ideal student here, is one who is prepared to admit the possibility of a spiritual experience, which would transcend the physical senses and the rational mind, and willing to give unprejudiced consideration, right? An open mind. We should not be fearful in having an open mind, because with an open mind, you can choose to accept that what is beneficial and reject what is not. So with an open mind, with awareness, and with a strong foundation of your understanding, you can grow more. You can grow very fast. So such a person would not commit the mistake of thinking that the intellect would be able to penetrate the inner meanings of Buddhism. But in fact, it is through spiritual practice that one can be awakened. This is why back in the days of the Buddhas, and even today, there are people who they're illiterate, they don't know how to read, but yet they can penetrate reality. And that is because reality, enlightenment, goes beyond language, goes beyond words. And here I'm not saying that studying intellect has no value. It helps us, but there's a trap behind it. We become attached to our own intellect, and it becomes a hindrance. But we should put more emphasis on that spiritual practice carries more weight in penetrating reality. Right? Does it make sense? Right. So in other words, we have to put into practice what we learn, not just lip service. Right? All intending students of Buddhism would do well to remember that spiritual essence, the spiritual essence that underlies and interpenetrates all doctrinal formulations will be reviewed not in proportion to the bulk of our scholastic equipment, but only with the right motive. The right motive here is the right view, right? The right directions. Eventually, we will get there. So what's right aspiration or right motive or right view? How do we know that we are cultivating right view? Well, there's a simple definition for it. And that is, in our right view, there is no greed, no hatred. You don't have the thoughts of causing pain and inflict pain on others. So that's how we know that we have a right view. For example, let's say we're raising our children, and we may yell at the children, but that doesn't mean it's wrong, because the children are making mistakes, and we want to teach the children the lessons. Whereas parents who pamper the children, they may not be doing the proper thing. They might not be doing justice to the children because they're spoiling their children. You may have seen this in public, where like in a supermarket or a department store, right? Kids yelling, they yell at the parents that, I want this toy, I want this thing on the shelf. And the parents say, no, we gotta shop, we gotta get something else first. And the child said, no, I want this right now, right? So, that has come to a point where, well, that child got used to being pampered, and he could not accept the fact that other people could not cater to their needs, their wants, actually, right? And so that's not necessarily, that's not right. So the right view is, we should not judge on the surface, but we should judge on the essence of it. But we should be true to ourselves when we introduce Buddhism or whatever it is to others. Help, a word of advice. Is it embedded with greed, anger, delusion? Meaning, when we give encouragement, when we give financial support, is there an agenda behind it? Just because you give doesn't mean that it's meritorious. Because there are many, this is often in the political realm, right? Political contributions. I mean, those political contributions were full of self-centeredness, full of personal agenda, right? So when we give advice, we help somebody, we should ask ourselves, are we cultivating right view? Meaning, do we have greed, anger, delusion in that, or hatred in that? And so the purity of the mind here should be helpful in understanding of the teaching. Right? When we have this pure mind, it helps us, because now we're consistent with Buddhism. right? When you're consistent, you can resonate with it. If Buddhism is teaching no self or selflessness, but here whatever we do is very self-centeredness. We may say all the right words, but it doesn't mean that we have the right understanding. In fact, we may not even know what we're saying because it's completely opposite of what Buddhism is teaching. Right? But when we have this period of the mind, meaning no greed, no anger, no hatred, animosity towards others, then it helps us to understand the teaching. Right? So here's very interesting. It says that the way in which a man lives is not unrelated to his capacity to understand the truth. And this is so fundamental Buddhism. How we live our lives is really how we comprehend reality. Right? There are people who believe that accumulating wealth is the best thing in the world, and that should be the only motive. In fact, people would say that, if you're out in the world, it's a dog kind of world. If you're not the first one to attack, you are going to be attacked. So that's how they see the world, and that's not reality from Buddhism, from a Buddhist perspective. And we believe that the Buddha has achieved enlightenment, and therefore his teachings are true. So we've talked about believing faith in the Buddha in the past. Faith, how do we know that Buddha said the truth? How do we know that Buddha has achieved enlightenment? Well, there are three things that we can base on. One is that we know that there is a higher calling than just being selfish, right? There's something very attractive and noble about being selfless, right? We all look up to those who are selfless, right? We admire those who are willing to sacrifice themselves to help others. So there is something that's beyond that we can admire, so we can resonate with the higher calling. So that's one. The other is based on text, sutra that we can read about his teachings. And the third is based on experience, our own personal experience. When we put ourselves in practice to remove self-centeredness, we feel better about it, right? When we help somebody, it makes us feel better. And so we know that we are getting closer to that higher calling. So we know that higher calling is something that that exists. It's not just imagination, but it exists and it's useful. So when the Buddha teaches selflessness, then we know that is the higher calling, the truth. So anything that is against that, then we should put a question mark. So the study of the Dharma will be fruitful if we hanker down on spiritual life, meaning we commit to living a spiritual life. So we can see that the morality is very foundational in Buddhism, and it's very foundational in understanding the truth. And that's why in Buddhism, that's called a threefold study. Precepts, meditation, and wisdom being the foundation. Right? When you live a moral life, you feel better about yourself. You have no regrets. The things that you do, you have no regrets. When you can look yourself in the mirror and say, I have done nothing wrong, it's a very powerful feeling about it. And it gives you a sense of confidence. And when that self-confidence, when you apply in meditation, you exert this self-confidence that allows you to subside all negative thoughts. You may not have done those things, but sometimes you could be influenced by the environment, but you can easily, put aside those negative thoughts. If you don't keep the precepts, live a moral life, and you practice meditation, it can be very harmful. Let me explain. When you have a sheet of paper that is blank, even a single drop of ink, you can visibly see it, right? Even a slight mark of a pencil, you can easily see it. So what happens is when you sit in meditation, your mind is blank, or at least you're forcing your mind to be blank, and then you're making your sheet of paper you're trying to be in a very clean environment. But when you sit in meditation, And when you're very under intense focus, intense meditation, a single thought of guilt can be exposed, just like you're watching yourself under a microscope, and you will feel terrible about it. So that's what happens is that when we don't have a strong foundation of a moral life, and when we practice meditation, we will not be successful because that magnification of our faults, we will feel terrible about it. And that's will be an obstruction because you continue to get locked into that negativity and you can never get out of it because you continue to think about it, you continue to magnify it, and therefore you can never escape that negativity. And therefore, morality, living a moral life, living a selfless life is so critical to the success of studying Buddhism, to achieving enlightenment, right? And it helps us to transition to transcendental more effectively. When we live a moral life, we are integrating our energies, our psychological energies, our emotional energies, right? Our spiritual energies. We are heading in one direction. Otherwise, we're sharing the words of selflessness, but yet we are living in a selfish way, and we are saying, something else. We are contradicting ourselves. We are pulling ourselves in different directions. We are not one unified self walking in one direction. So you can imagine you're being pulled in different directions. What happens? You become stagnant. You cannot go anywhere, and you're drained. Your energy will be drained, and you feel tired, and you will give up because you're drained. And so when we are one person heading in one direction, our energies are united. We can easily transition from mundane to transcendental. Does it make sense? Right? So that's why it's more effective, and that's why living a moral life is critical to the success of our study. Right? With the right motivation for migrating to Sukhavati, which is the Western Pure Land. The right motivation is that we want to migrate to the Sukhavati, 极乐世界, the Western Pure Land, is to gain enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, not to have a good life, not to have to worry about work or food ever again. That's not the purpose of going to Western Pure Land, but to gain enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, and not to evade difficulties in life, right? That is the right motivation. So that you can see how it all ties together, right? I hope I painted good enough of a picture to show you why it is that we want to have a proper understanding of the Dharma. We need to practice, meaning we need to put selflessness into practice. And living a moral life, it helps us to gain a proper understanding of the Dharma, right? Does it make sense? Right? Any comments? Okay. Though it may be true that the most serious obstacles to proper understanding exist in the student's mind, and though it may be the fact that psychological obstructions are generally much more difficult to remove, it would be a mistake to assume that once the practitioner is furnished with the key of the right motive, no further difficulties will be encountered, that every door will fly open when he approaches. We should not have the false expectation that when we humbly ask for the proper understanding and we have the right view, well, we're trying our best to practice Buddhism, right, in our own earnest, that we want to practice and study Buddhism, that we should not expect difficulties. That is false expectation. Most people come to a temple or whatnot, and they pray to the Buddha, please protect me. I want to change my way of living, my way of life. I want to study Buddhism. Please protect me. When you pray to the Buddha like that, the Buddha will answer your prayers. but it doesn't mean that he will remove your difficulties, because those difficulties are essentials in our practice. If we learn and we encounter no difficulties, then how do we know we have advanced? Right? Without challenges, how do we know that we have advanced? For example, we learn about selflessness. We will be perhaps we will be encountered with the challenge of giving. People coming to test us, to ask for advice, and we say, no, I don't want to help you. I want to protect my meditative bliss, right? I want to have a good life. I want a good career. I want to make sure I have a financial independence, so therefore I can help you. Well, then we're not learning. We have not really understood the concept. Or to say, I want to become a Buddha, but yet I don't want to help anybody. Like, then you can never become a Buddha, because the result of becoming Buddha is because of helping sentient beings. I mean, said differently, you don't become a Buddha by pursuing Buddhahood, but you become a Buddha because of your heroic sacrifice to help others. Does it make sense? Right? We become a Buddha not because we want to sit on a throne for people to worship, but the Buddha makes many sacrifices, lifetime after lifetime. So when we say we want to be a Buddha, we should ask ourselves, are we willing to make sacrifices? Are we heroic enough, courageous enough to make sacrifices? Right? And there are people who are worthy of praise and sometimes worship. It's because they are heroic in their way of life, right? They're willing to sacrifice to do things for others. And so when we approach the doors of Buddhism, we should not expect all difficulties to be eliminated, but we should anticipate difficulties. Difficulties are not a problem. When we are equipped with empowerment to overcome difficulties, that's the value of Buddhism, right? When we learn Buddhism, not to avoid difficulties, but we learn Buddhism to empower us, to enable us to overcome difficulties. Does it make sense? Right? So with the right motive, we should not expect difficulties to go away. Because what if we stand at the wrong door? We have the right motive, but with the right key of motive, we at the wrong door. Or when we have, we're at the right door, but with the wrong key. So what does that mean? What that means is that when we have the right intentions to practice Buddhism, to cultivate selflessness, we need to have the proper way of studying and the proper way of approaching it. So that means we need to have the right materials and the right way of practicing Buddhism. So with the right materials, we should be aware that there are limitations with the published works based on researches into Buddhism. Not every article on the internet can be trusted, right? Even though they may be backed up by research, but doesn't mean that it's valuable towards enlightenment. Scientifically trained scholars not only conduct researches into Buddhism, but also publish their results in books and magazines. Right? Such publications are generally, for a long time, the sole sources of knowledge available to the student. So accept them at their face value, regard them as authentic expositions of the Dharma, can be detrimental, because those are intellectual works. They are not spiritual works. And so as long as the works in questions recognize the limitations of the scientific method, then there will be little harm to the student. But if we take that face value, then it could be harm. So unfortunately, the majority of them appear to be quite unconscious that intellect is powerless to penetrate the reality, the truth. So should the unwary student be so unfortunate as to encounter such works, then this could be very misleading, and irreparable harm may be done. It could be a quote, it could turn, you have the wrong, once you have the wrong understanding, it's very difficult to retract. Just like you're shooting an arrow and you are pointed in the wrong directions, and once you let go, you cannot recall that arrow. It has flown away, and you cannot recall it. So once we are on the wrong path with the wrong view, false view, it is very difficult because it makes us more egoistic, and we will not be able to accept that we are wrong. The arrogance, especially for a person who has achieved high position with a lot of followers, you cannot admit that you're wrong. One is because of egoistic protection, our embarrassment, or they may even rationalize that I have to show I'm a strong leader, I cannot admit my fault. And so he's just fooling himself, right? So it's very, very, we have to be very selective and be cautious of the materials that we are receiving. Only if we have roots of merits, the strength, extraordinary strength of roots of merits, can we overcome such misunderstanding. So it's important to avoid from the very beginning practically all books which are merely about Buddhism, right? There's a lot of articles about Buddhism. We should be very careful in accepting those to be Buddhist scriptures, right? Of course, more reliable is to read the actual words of the Buddha, the sayings and writings of his enlightened disciples through the ages. So, reputable translations and sources and gurus that we should study from. Temptation to derive knowledge and guidance from popular manuals written by non-Buddhists should be firmly resisted, right? Because they don't practice themselves. They just write because of this is scientific research. We should be very careful in accepting those as on face value. So the ideal method of studying Buddhism would be to read the original language, if possible. It's very difficult. And a number of carefully selected texts belonging to the Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, Mongolian, or Japanese canonical Buddhist literature. So those sources are more reliable, right, than those online articles. Okay. The meaning of these words, such as nirvana, samsara, sita, dharma, prajna, moksha, all those things, even our current language would not be enough to describe their meanings. And sometimes useful to leave those words as they are and translate them in parentheses of some sort, right? And we should try to understand the original words, language as possible, which is difficult. But if we don't, the modern language could distort the meanings of the teachings of the Dharma, right? The greater the number of keywords translated and the more understandable the translation appears at the beginning to the student, the greater the degree of distortion. So here's the author is warning that we should be careful in accepting any articles out there that seems to be very simple, right? Such a method of study will impose great difficulties on the student, but it is better to arrive with difficulty at a true understanding of the Dharma than to arrive with ease at an understanding that is wrong and false. So we should put in, if it is so important to us, then we should put in the effort to study. Does it make sense? Right? Okay. So the importance, so we have the right motive, we have the right method, the right materials. Then the next is the right method of study. So that's also important too, right? You have the, it's part of the equation. because if we don't have the right method of study or practice, then we will not arrive at the right destination. So though the student may grasp the the right motivation, the right material, the right method is also important. In ancient India, most of the studying was through listening. So learning back then was to recite and study and meditate upon it at the feet of one's teachers. You want to listen to the sutra, you have to go to the temple to hear the master, the monk, recite the sutras. It's not like today. You want to listen to sutra, you just go online and you can download your favorite audio, right? So learning and hearing were represented by the same word, which is to hear, really. And not that because they lacked material writing to learn, but because of they want to get spiritual experience out of it. It's different. It's very different. The experience is very different when you're online listening to a lecture, as opposed to being in the lecture, right? Being part of the Dharma assembly, for example, it's different from like watching a concert online than to be in the concert to listen to the music, right? It's completely different. So back then they focused more on this personal transmissions of the teachings to gain, to realize the truth. So we should take advantage of learning opportunities to study with a guru. Students who is fortunate enough to live in places where the Dharma does not shine, and then they should take advantage of the temporary presence of those members of the Sangha. Should there be lectures that they should try to attend. And here the author is encouraging those who have access to the Dharma should discuss on a regular basis, should share the experiences and share the teachings and come together to study if they have that options, right? So what did they do? What should people do if they want to study Buddhism and they don't have access to a teacher? Well, one way is to cultivate good roots and merits, he says, and because that will help us to increase the chances of meeting a good teacher. If you are resonating with something and you exert that energy, it's easier to resonate with something that when you're in that environment. Meaning that if you have good intentions to learn Buddhism and you continue to do good deeds, to cultivate good roots, meaning you learn as much as you can, and you practice selflessness, you are creating that environment of selflessness, which is consistent with Buddhism. And therefore, you will create this environment for Buddhism to arise. Does it make sense? Even though we don't have access to Buddhism, we may not have good spiritual friends, but if we have this intention of wanting to learn Buddhism, and we put in practice whatever we have learned to help others to cultivate selflessness, then we are making the ground very fertile for the seed of the Dharma to grow. Does it make sense? Right? So we should despair that we don't have access to great gurus. As long as we're willing to put in the efforts, willing to practice selflessness, then we are making the ground fertile for the Dharma seed to grow. Does it make sense? Right? Okay. So what that means here is it takes us to the next topic I want to share with you, and this is very important, and this is very critical and practical, and that is the consistency between the Dharma study and a way of life. And the two should be flowing in the same direction. And otherwise, we will encounter all kinds of difficulties. And this is critical. And I have about 15 minutes to share with you. And before we wrap this up, and I have a little more to share, but we'll leave for next time. But what I want to leave with you today is this last piece here, which is critical. It is important. So when we have the right motive, and we have the right materials, and we even have the right method as well to practice, and we need to be we need to be aware of one more difficulty, right? And this could probably the most dangerous of them all is that when we are living a life that is not consistent with our study, it could break and tear everything apart. It could destroy all that we have accumulated. So we have this two sides of the coin, which is reality. And as long as the two sides are consistent, we have this coin. And if the two sides are not consistent, start diverging, then we no longer have that coin. We no longer have that reality. And if we make this distinction, right? A coin, can you distinguish? Can you take apart the heads and the tails? You cannot, because it's the same coin. But if we want to split the two, we to make differences and distinguish between the two, then we are creating difficulties for ourselves. So the more that we practice Buddhism, the more that we should become non-attached without isolation. It sounds contradictory, right? Non-attached, but without isolation. And that is the middle path. Meaning that the more that we practice Buddhism, the more appreciative that we are of ourselves, and the more that we appreciate others, and that we truly wish them happiness and prosperity. It's not about self-isolation. It's not about our own personal meditative bliss, but in our heart, we truly wish that others will be prosperous and happy as well, and that we become non-attached. But this does not mean that we are losing our feelings. We don't become dry and numb, right? The wrong way of practicing meditation is to numb your senses and to become insensitive to the needs of the world, the needs of the family, the needs of friends. The right way is that when we practice Buddhism, and we're practicing right mindfulness, right meditation, right proper meditation, our hearts becomes more sensitive, without, of course, about being afflicted, but you're more sensitive to the needs of others, without afflicting yourself. So what that means is that the more that we practice Buddhism, we become normal in the sense that we live a normal life. We don't have this contradictory of religious study and living a life. There's no contradiction. You are one united self walking on the road of life. Does it make sense? That is Buddhism, right? And the more appreciative of who we are and what we want, and the more appreciative of others. And not only that, but we are better at resolving problems. We don't run away from problems, right? We have no fear. When problems come, we are equipped to resolve problems. That is because we have the proper understanding of conditionality, the Dharma, right? We become non-attached to things, people, and situations. What does that mean in the non-state of non-attachment? When we are in the proper state of non-attachment, we feel serene, confident, balanced in ourselves. Right? We do not settle or get stuck on things. We don't become attached to things, and not that we are self-contained. We are self-contained, but we don't become isolated. Right? We have the ability to help, but we're not arrogant. Right? We don't look down on people. When we help people, it is out of compassion, not because, oh, poor you, pity you, that I'm helping you. Right? And one does not feel the need to reach out to make one feel better or to make one feel complete and whole. Or we don't appropriate things to fulfill ourselves. Right? We don't, in other words, we don't go out and share the teachings because we want we want company. We want followers. We want company to make us feel happy. We share because out of compassion, right? So one doesn't insist on keeping certain elements of experience to oneself. One is not attached to his idea. One has the confidence and wider vision to be free from being neurotically involved with things. As should be clear, generosity is intrinsic to this positive mental event. That's why we practice loving kindness is to create a positive energy, a positive environment around us to enable us to perceive without fear, because there is no selfishness. If there is selfishness, there is fear. The way to remove fear is not to accumulate, not to appropriate things, but to eliminate selfishness, right? To cultivate selflessness. Does it make sense? Right. So being non-attached does not mean that being self-contained in a hard-edged way. It is not quite the same as being self-sufficient, which may imply a certain self-protectiveness. It's about being an individual, being self-aware, being objective, being responsible and sensitive, and not about self-assertion. Studying Buddhism is not to escape from anything. Buddhism should give us the self-confidence to deal with anything head on, right? Should there be any financial difficulties, we have a way of overcoming financial difficulties. For example, the Buddha teaches us about conditionality. Conditionality here means that when you want something, you provide the conditions and the proper input. If you want to overcome financial difficulties, you should practice giving of wealth and not harbor greed. That's the proper way of overcoming financial difficulties. It may be difficult at first to give away your hard-earned money, but by doing that, you are making the fertile ground for financial seed to grow. Right? There are people who work night and day, 2 jobs, even 3 jobs, and it's very difficult for them to overcome financial difficulties. But yet there are those who don't even need to work. They just put money in a certain stock, right? And then a year later, the money grows. Or they don't need to work very hard. Maybe they do. I'm not sure. But the money flows in very abundantly, right? They make hundreds of $1,000s a second, for example. And so we know that the reason is because the ground is very fertile for their financial seed to grow. Right? So we want to achieve something, we have to do the preparation. We want meditative bliss. We can't be doing clubbing every weekend and expect to have a calm mind. We should live a moral life, have no guilt, and grow good roots. Then it will be an easy transition to a meditative bliss, right? So we have to provide that ground. We should be true to ourselves. So what is it that you want? What is it that we should ask ourselves? What is it that we want? And then we provide the conditions. And so the more that we study Buddhism, the more fearlessness we should have, because we have the equipment, we have what is needed to tackle problems. In fact, we will not see those as problems. We will see them as opportunities. Does it make sense? There's a big difference between seeing things as problems versus opportunities, right? Some people who are very afraid of waking up in the morning because of difficulties, they don't want to face the world. But yet there are people who jump right out of bed and say, today is the day that I'm going to be better, right? It's a much more powerful feeling than to say, oh, I don't know what's going to happen today, right? You want to seize the day in your hand and say, this is my opportunity to be better than yesterday, right? That is more powerful. And studying Buddhism should allow us to feel that way, right? So practicing Buddhism should help us to achieve the balance between reality and spirituality. We have this spirituality. For example, we're practicing meditation with meditative bliss. It is not only that at the time that we sit in meditation hall that we have meditative bliss, but we can have that meditative bliss anywhere in the world. That is more useful than sitting inside a room, right? And that's how we know that we have arrived, if you will. That is how we know that we have made progress. It's because of difficulties that we know how much we have progress. right? So practicing Buddhism should make us happy Buddhists. And I don't mean that to be a goal, but it's just a natural fruition of our proper practice, right? It's not, studying Buddhism is not only about feeling happy, but it's about knowing that you have the ability to overcome difficulties. That's where the joy comes from. You agree? Right? The joy comes from knowing that you have the ability to overcome any difficulties whatsoever, right? All right, so we will talk more about what it means to be a happy Buddhist, because if we don't, I think that point is also important too, but I'll leave for next time because we're about coming to an end here, is how to be a happy Buddhist. And because it's not through forcing ourselves in studying Buddhism or practicing meditation that we become happy. But there is another element that we need to consider in order to be a happy Buddhist. So a happy Buddhist, a happy life, and happy Buddhist, happy life, that cycle reinforces each other. And we will discuss that next time, right? Does it make sense? Right? Any comments? Okay. All right, we will proceed with merit dedication. If you can please join me. We together, we recite, may the merits and virtues accrue today, adorn the Buddha Pure Lands, repay 4 types of kindness above, and aid those suffering in the paths below. May those who see and hear of this bring forth the resolve for the Bodhi mind. When this retribution body is complete, together we shall meet in the land of ultimate bliss. If you could please rise and we bow to the Buddha 3 times again to show our respect. First bow, second bow, and third bow. Amida Society. All right, please stay back for lunch.